The Great War, Part 3. Treaty of Versailles. Russia withdraws. Russia withdraws. In March 1917, there was civil unrest in Russia, due in large part to war-related shortages of food and fuel. Caesar Nicholas was forced to step down. In his place, a provisional government was established. 8 months after the new government took over, a revolution shook Russia. In November 1917, the communist leader Vladimir Ilyich Lenin seized power. Lenin insisted on ending his country's involvement in the war. In March 1918, Germany and Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which ended the war between them. The Central Powers collapse. Russia's withdrawal from the war at last allowed Germany to send nearly all its forces to the Western Front. In March 1918, the Germans mounted one final massive attack on the Allies in France. May 1918, the Germans had again reached the Marne River. The Allies, with the aid of nearly 140,000 fresh US troops, launched a counter-attack in July 1918. The Allies and Germans clashed at the Second Battle of the Marne. Allies forces smashed the German troops and advanced slowly towards Germany. The Central Powers collapse continues. Soon, the Central Powers began to crumble. First, the Bulgarians and then the Ottoman Turks surrendered. In October, revolution swept through Austria-Hungary. In Germany, soldiers mutinied, and the public turned on the Kaiser. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II stepped down. Germany declared itself a republic. The German government signed an armistice, an agreement to stop fighting with France. On November 11, 1918, World War I came to an end. The legacy of the war. World War I was in many ways a new kind of war. It involved the use of new technologies. It also left behind a landscape of death and destruction such as was never seen before. Both sides in World War I paid a tremendous price in terms of human life. About 8.5 million soldiers died as a result of the war. Another 21 million were wounded. In addition, the war led to the death of countless civilians by way of starvation, disease, and slaughter. Taken together, these figures spell tragedy. An entire generation of Europeans was wiped out. The legacy of the war. World War I was in many ways a new kind of war. It involved the use of new technology. It also left behind a landscape of death and destruction such as was never before seen. Both sides in World War I paid a tremendous price in terms of human life. The legacy of the war. About 8.5 million soldiers died as a result of the war. Another 21 million were wounded. In addition, the war led to the death of countless civilians by way of starvation, disease, and slaughter. Taken together, these figures spell tragedy. An entire generation of Europeans wiped out. The legacy of the war. The war also had a devastating economic impact on Europe. The Great Conflict drained the treasuries of European countries. One account put the total cost of the war at 338 billion US dollar, a staggering amount for that time. The war also destroyed acres of farmland, as well as homes, villages, and towns. The enormous suffering that resulted from the Great War left a deep mark on Western society as well. A sense of disillusionment settled over the survivors. The insecurity and despair that many people experienced are reflected in the art and literature of the time. The legacy of the war. Another significant legacy of the war lay in its peace agreement. The treaties to end World War I were forged after great debate and compromise. While they sought to bring a new sense of security and peace to the world, they prompted mainly anger and resentment. And the figure on the right shows us World War I statistics. Battlefield death of major combatants, so this number of people died. Okay, from the USA, 116,000 soldiers, or 116,000 human lives. Ottoman Empire, 325,000. Italy, 650,000. The British Empire, 908,000 were dead or killed. Austria-Hungary, 1.2 million persons died. France, 1.3 million died. Russia, 1.7 million. And at last, Germany, 1.8 million persons died. These numbers include troops from Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and South Africa. The one that is marked with the asterisk, which relates to the British Empire, by the way. So the total number of troops mobilized. Allied powers in total 42 million were mobilized, and Central powers 23 million persons. A flawed peace. Setting the stage, World War I was over. The killing had stopped. The terms of peace, however, still had to be worked out. On January 18, 1919, a conference to establish those terms began at the Palace of Versailles, outside Paris. Attending the talks, known as the Paris Peace Conference, were delegates representing 32 countries. For 1 year, this conference would be the sense of vigorous, often bitter debate. The Allied powers struggled to solve their conflicting aims in various peace treaties. Woodrow Wilson's 14-point plan. The Allies meet and debate. Despite representatives from numerous countries, the meeting's major decisions were hammered out by a group known as the Big Four. Woodrow Wilson of the United States, Georges Clemenceau of France, David Lloyd George of Great Britain, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy. Russia, in the grip of civil war, was not represented. Neither were Germany and its allies. Wilson's plan for peace in January 1918, while the war was still raging, President Wilson had drawn up a series of peace proposals, known as the 14 Points. They outlined a plan for achieving a just and lasting peace. The Versailles Treaty. It was between Germany and the Allied powers and was signed on June 28, 1919, 5 years to the day after Franz Ferdinand's assassination in Sarajevo. Adopting Wilson's 14th point, the treaty created a League of Nations. The League was to be an international association whose goal would be to keep the peace among nations. The Versailles Treaty. Article 231. It was also known as the War Guilt Clause. It placed sole responsibility for the war on Germany's shoulders. As a result, Germany had to pay reparations to the Allies. The Versailles Treaty was just one of 5 treaties negotiated by the Allies. In the end, these agreements created feelings of bitterness and betrayal among the victors and the defeated. Europe post-World War I. This was the division after the World War. Germany, in its own island, okay. New countries started to evolve after that. New nations were formed. The creation of new nations. These treaties too led to huge land losses for the Central Powers. Several new countries were created out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia were all recognized as independent nations. And this a piece of newspaper, I think relates back to 1920 something, no 1918. Armistice signed, end of the war. Berlin seized by revolutionists. New Chancellor begs for order. Kaiser flees to Holland. Mandates. The Ottoman Turks were forced to give up almost all of their former empire. They retained only the territory that is today the country of Turkey. The Allies carved up the land that the Ottomans lost in Southwest Asia into mandates rather than independent nations. Palestine, Iraq, and Transjordan came under British control. Syria and Lebanon went to France. The creation of new nations. Russia, which had left the war early, suffered land losses as well. Romania and Poland both gained Russian territory. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, formerly part of Russia, became independent nations. The settlements at Versailles represented, as one observer noted, a peace built on quicksand. Indeed, that quicksand eventually would give way. In a little more than 2 decades, the treaty's legacy of bitterness would help plunge the world into another catastrophic war. And here we can see the main points of the Treaty of Versailles, major provisions. The League of Nations, International Peace Organization, enemy and neutral nations initially excluded. Germany and Russia excluded. Then, territorial losses. Germany returns Alsace-Lorraine to France. French border extended to the west bank of Rhine River. Germany surrenders all of its overseas colonies in Africa and the Pacific. Military restrictions. Limits set on the size of the German army. Germany prohibited from importing or manufacturing weapons or war material. Germany forbidden to build or buy submarines or have an air force. So simply, Germany was banned to have an army. War guilt. So responsibility for the war placed on Germany's shoulders. Germany forced to pay the Allies $33 billion in reparations over 30 years. So you don't have to pay them just once, but throughout 30 years they start to pay this $33 billion. End of the Great War Part 3.